The screams echoed through the concrete walls of ADX Florence. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in movies, it was deep, real, and filled with pain. The sound came from a man named Marcus Reed, a former gang leader from Chicago who thought he could handle anything. But inside this place even the toughest men broke. Marcus had been locked in his cell for 23 hours a day, staring at the same gray walls, talking to no one but himself. That morning he finally lost it. He slammed his fists against the steel door, shouting at the guards, his voice cracking from madness and loneliness. And then something inside him snapped. As guards rushed to his cell, Marcus's body shook. He pressed his forehead against the cold concrete, whispering something no one could understand. When the door finally opened, the guards froze. What they saw would haunt them forever. But how did Marcus get here? And what really drives men insane inside the world's most secure prison? It all began 3 years earlier when Marcus was sentenced to life without parole. He had led a violent street gang that ruled parts of Chicago. He wasn't scared when the judge gave him his sentence. He even smirked, thinking prison would be easy. But ADX Florence wasn't like any other prison. It was called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, built to hold the most dangerous men alive. When Marcus first arrived, he was taken off the bus in chains that clinked with every step. Even his fingers and toes were cuffed. Armed guards led him through tall steel gates and thick glass doors. The air was cold and everything smelled like metal and bleach. The walls were pure concrete, designed so no sound could escape. He was given his own tiny cell. No cellmate, no one to talk to. Just a bed made of concrete, a small desk, and a toilet. The only light came from a slit in the ceiling that let in a thin slice of daylight. He would spend 23 hours there every single day. At first, Marcus thought he could handle it. He did push-ups, stared at the clock, counted the cracks in the walls. But after a few weeks, the silence started to get to him. He would shout just to hear his own voice. He began talking to the walls, pretending they answered back. Sometimes he'd laugh for no reason. Other times he'd cry in silence. His only break was 1 hour in a small cage outside, barely big enough to stretch his legs. No other inmates. No talking. Just wind and silence. The guards never spoke to him unless they had to. The only voices he heard were his own, echoing in his head. One night, Marcus started hearing whispers. He thought someone was calling his name through the vents. He pressed his ear against the wall, listening. The voice told him to do things, to fight back, to make them hear him. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think. The next morning, he saw his reflection in the stainless steel toilet. His eyes looked empty, wild. He didn't recognize himself anymore. And that was when he made a decision that would shake the entire prison. He pressed the emergency button on his wall and waited for the guards to come. When they did, Marcus stepped back, smiling in a way that made their blood run cold. He had something planned. Something that would remind everyone that even inside ADX Florence, not all men could be controlled. The guards shouted his name, but Marcus didn't answer. The lights flickered, the alarm blared, and within seconds, chaos erupted inside the world's most secure prison. The alarm thundered through every corridor of ADX Florence. Red lights flashed across the cold concrete walls. Guards rushed down the narrow hallways, shields raised, ready for anything. Inside his cell, Marcus Reed stood perfectly still, staring at the blinking light above his door. His breathing was slow, calm, too calm. When the guards burst in, Marcus didn't resist. He just smiled. On the wall behind him, written in something dark and wet, were the words, "This place breaks men." It wasn't blood, but it looked close enough to scare anyone. The guards ordered him to the ground. Marcus didn't move. He whispered, "You can't break me if I'm already broken." They tackled him to the floor, handcuffed him, and dragged him out. But what no one noticed was that Marcus had hidden something small inside his sleeve, a piece of metal from the vent he'd been loosening for weeks. He'd been planning this moment carefully, pretending to go insane while slowly preparing a move that would shake the entire facility. They took him to the segregation block, the hole. It was a darker, even quieter place, meant to crush the spirit completely. No window. No sound. Just darkness and silence. But Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. The darkness felt like home. He had a plan now, something to focus on, and that made him dangerous again. Days passed. Maybe weeks. Time didn't exist in the hole. Every second felt like a full hour. Marcus whispered to himself to stay sane, but the walls whispered back. He heard voices again, some real, some not. One voice belonged to a man named Luis Vega, another inmate locked nearby. Luis had been at ADX for 10 years. They couldn't see each other, but they could talk through the pipes if they whispered close enough. Luis warned Marcus, Don't fight the place. It always wins. But Marcus didn't believe that. He told Luis about his plan, to make the prison listen, to show them that no man could be silenced forever. Luis tried to stop him, but Marcus had already made up his mind. Late one night the lights flickered again. Marcus pulled out the metal piece he had hidden inside his mattress. He used it to scrape at the air vent, making the hole just wide enough to slide something through. He whispered to Luis, passing him small messages, drawings, words, anything to remind him that they were still human. But the guards eventually found the vent damage. They stormed in, furious, and dragged Marcus out again. He was strapped to a restraint chair, arms and legs tied so tight that his skin burned. A guard leaned close and said, "You think you're special? This place breaks everyone." Marcus looked up, his voice trembling but strong. "Maybe," he said, "but you'll remember me." After that he stopped eating for days. The doctors called it refusal to comply. But for Marcus it was control. It was the only thing left that belonged to him. Then one afternoon, a young guard named Daniels entered his cell with a meal tray. Daniels wasn't like the others, he still had kindness in his eyes. He placed the tray down gently and said, "Man, just eat something. Don't let this place kill you." Marcus looked up slowly. "It already did," he said. Daniels sighed and turned to leave, but just as he did, Marcus saw his chance. He lunged forward, grabbing the guard's arm and pulling him hard against the bars. The tray crashed to the ground. Alarms started blaring again. Guards shouted. Marcus's grip was desperate, wild. It took 4 officers to pull him back. They sedated him, dragging his limp body down the hall as the prison went back into lockdown. 4 hours, everything was silent again, until the morning shift came. When the guards opened Marcus's cell the next day, his bed was empty. His restraints were cut. And on the wall, scratched deep into the concrete, were the same words again. "This place breaks men." But Marcus Reed was gone. The moment the guards realized Marcus Reed had vanished, chaos spread through ADX Florence. No one had ever escaped this prison, not once. The warden stormed through the corridors barking orders. Every door was locked, every inmate checked. But Marcus was nowhere to be found. Inside the control room, cameras played back hours of footage. The last recording of Marcus showed him lying still on his bed, not moving. Then, right before the screen went static, a faint shadow crossed the wall near the vent, too fast to identify. "Check the ventilation system," the warden ordered. Teams of guards rushed through the tunnels that ran beneath the prison. The air was cold and smelled of rust. The vents were small, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. But Marcus had been chipping away at his for months, weakening the bolts a little each day, waiting for the perfect moment. As the guards followed the vent trail, they found pieces of torn prison fabric, small smudges of blood, and the sharp metal piece he'd used. He was hurt, but he was alive when he got out of his cell. Hours turned into a full day. They searched every inch of the facility. Still no Marcus. Some of the guards began whispering that maybe the prison had finally swallowed him whole, that he didn't escape but broke completely and ended his own life somewhere in the dark. But the warden refused to believe that. "Find him," he said again. Meanwhile, deep under the prison, Marcus was still crawling. The vents led to a narrow maintenance shaft used only during construction. It hadn't been opened in years. He could barely breathe, his hands torn and bleeding, his heart pounding in his chest. But he kept going. In his head, he heard Luis's voice, the other inmate from the hole. "Don't fight the place. It always wins." But Marcus whispered back, "Not this time." When he finally reached the end of the shaft, he hit a wall. A solid steel grate blocked the way out. His body was weak, trembling from exhaustion, but he pushed with everything he had. The grate didn't move. He tried again, screaming until his throat burned. Nothing. And then he started laughing. A broken, hopeless laugh that echoed through the metal tunnel. All that work, all that pain, and still he was trapped. Above him, faint footsteps echoed. The guards were closing in. Marcus lay back against the cold steel, his body shaking. He pulled out something small from his prison pants, a folded piece of paper he'd kept hidden for months. On it were words he had written for Luis. "They can cage my body, not my mind." Marcus took a deep breath, closed his eyes and waited. When the guards found him hours later, he was sitting quietly in the dark, blood on his hands, a strange calm on his face. He didn't speak a word. He just stared at them, almost peaceful. They carried him back to his cell, patched up his wounds and placed him on suicide watch. From that day, Marcus never tried to escape again. But something inside him had changed. He stopped speaking to anyone, not even to Luis through the pipes. He He just stared at the walls, whispering to himself. The doctors said he had psychological collapse. His mind had broken under the pressure. Weeks later, a new inmate arrived. When he passed Marcus's cell, he saw him sitting motionless, his eyes blank. On the wall behind him were the words carved deep into the concrete one final time. Life inside ADX Florence, the prison that breaks men. The guards never erased it. Maybe they couldn't. Because deep down, everyone in that place knew the truth. Marcus Reed hadn't escaped ADX Florence. ADX Florence had escaped into him.